Hello, Epidemics. I hope everyone's doing well today. Has anybody figured out this brain teaser? No. Okay, this one must be a hard one.
Is it the amount of people that live on the world?
No, but it's very close to that.
Yeah, I figured. Isn't it like 8 billion or something?
I think we're still in the 7
okay.
billion something. This number is unique because it contains
Different number.
every number from 0 to 9 one time. Okay. Announcements, as usual. The quiz and the journal prompt are on Blackboard. They're due Sunday, January 30th before midnight. And there is a video I want you guys to watch, and you'll need to watch it before taking the quiz this week. The mobile food markets are coming up. If you guys haven't done this before and are able and willing to go to one of the campuses to pick up food, this is great. It is free food. It's farmers market style. The dates are over here on the right. So you do have to sign up so they know how much food to bring. And I've got this information on Blackboard, so you don't have to rush to write it down. But if you can't find it, go to the North Shore homepage and type help in the search box. There's an option for here to help. And it lists information about the mobile markets and how to sign up, but also a lot of other help that is available to students from both North Shore and the community. So I encourage you guys to pick this up. All right, so last time we talked, we were talking about COVID. And I know I kind of flew through what we know about COVID, and really there's a lot we don't know. But I will be bringing it up throughout the semester as we talk about other diseases. Does anybody have any questions that you want to ask about COVID that I haven't addressed yet?
The video explains it all.
The video explains it all. Good. All right. So today's lecture, I'm giving an overview of a lot of the concepts that we're going to see again and again and again this semester. So I'm starting with terminology, because we got to make sure that when I'm using a word, you guys know exactly what I mean. With a science background, I've got lots of weird, big words that you're probably not familiar with in my brain. And so I always want to make sure that I'm starting out defining my words. If I ever miss a word, if I use a word that you're not familiar with, please interrupt me and ask me to define it. Okay, so the terminology here is kind of what is an epidemic? What is a pandemic? What does endemic mean? So these are some of the basic terms about epidemics. I'm going to start with one word that's not on the screen here, and that's spillover. Spillover is very simple. When a zoonotic disease, oh, there's a new word, zoonotic. Have you guys heard that one before? Can you make a guess what it might mean? Nathan, you have your hand up. Nate.
I see the prefix zoo, So I'm assuming it has something to do with animals, maybe like a virus that was in animals that somehow mutated to become a human virus, SIV, HIV example.
Yeah, you're exactly right. It's a disease that is occurring in animals and can also infect people. And a spillover is when that disease crosses into humans. So zoonotic, disease that infects animals, but can infect humans. And new epidemics generally start, or one of the common ways they start is a spillover event. We are very confident that that's what happened with COVID. That's what happened with HIV. That's what happens every time there's an outbreak of Ebola. Nate.
What about that virus from a couple of Zika? Was that zoonotic as well? Remember that, the Zika virus?
I do remember that. I don't know off the top of my head the origin of that one. I'd have to look that one up. Sorry. An outbreak is a small number of cases in a small area. So we have had outbreaks of measles in communities where there's a lot of anti-vaccination sentiment and children are not vaccinated for measles. In the US, it occurs in other countries regularly, unfortunately. So it's, you know, that's the smallest form of a disease. In an epidemic, now we're talking about more cases, but still pretty localized. And when I say localized, I mean definitely one continent, but possibly multiple countries. You know, the United States is huge. And if we had an epidemic in the United States and Mexico and Canada, that would probably be considered right along that magic line between epidemic and pandemic, because it would be so huge. But if we're talking Europe and you have an epidemic in, say, the Netherlands and Belgium and Denmark, those are very small countries, and they probably would fit in the state of Texas. So we would just consider that an epidemic. Nate.
I noticed that you highlighted the prefixes. I know the prefix pan means like all or many, you know, like pansexual or other terms, but what does epi mean?
Oh, I wish you, you're asking me all these questions I don't know the answers to.
Sorry.
No, that's really good. I hadn't thought of that. I didn't highlight this. I stole it from somebody else. What does epi mean? Good question.
The only other instance I could think of is like epinephrine or like epicenter or something like that.
Yeah, it probably does have a meaning. But I can't, I don't know that I've ever heard that one. Really good question. Okay. Pandemic is very widespread, lots of cases. And this is one of those situations where there's not really a firm line between an outbreak and an epidemic, or between an epidemic and a pandemic. We know what the extremes are. We can pretty easily figure those out, but finding that line between these categories, there's not a strict definition that separates those. Now, I do want to mention at this point that when we're talking about epidemics, these do not have to be contagious diseases. Megan Googled epi, over, upon, at, on, before, or after. That's pretty vague.
Maybe before widespread, like that's the only correlation. Because, epidemic is before pandemic, but that is kind of vague compared to the
Yeah,
pan suffix, which it encompasses like all or many things.
yep. That's also probably why I don't know what it means, because it is kind of a vague word. All right, so epidemics, they don't have to be contagious diseases. Contagious means able to spread from person to person. So we can talk about the epidemic. People talk about the obesity epidemic, which is really problematic, but that's not within the scope of this class. Or you can talk about an epidemic of let's see, neurological diseases in Flint, Michigan, due to the water problem, due to lead in the water.
I know it's not like in a traditional sense, but would like the opioid epidemic, would that be one of those? Or like
Yep.
fentanyl, other, yeah.
Yep, the opioid overdose problem and use problem is definitely something that we could consider an epidemic. Absolutely. All right, so that's this terminology. The next thing I want to go over are methods of transmission. So this class really is about contagious diseases. So we're going to talk about how do they go from person to person. And there are several ways that this happens. I'm going to list them for you now, and we're going to go over them one at a time. There's airborne transmission, arthropod transmission. Arthropod refers to insects. It's not limited to insects, but in this case, it's insects. Fecal or oral, which can include foodborne and contaminated water. We're adults. Sex is one method of transmission. And other types of contact transmission. So I'm starting here with airborne. Airborne is how respiratory diseases are spread. So anything that infects the nose, the sinuses, the lungs is going to be spread through as airborne. And there's a lot of deep, fine details here. I know at one point there was a lot of debate about whether we should say COVID is airborne. I would say yes. There are some fine nitpicky details that specialists in the field might argue about that, but we're going with airborne for that. So COVID, flu, measles, there's a lot of diseases that are spread this way. Now, diseases that are spread by air, that they're airborne spread, can spread in the body outside of the respiratory system. This means that airborne spread, while respiratory diseases are the ones we think of, this form of spreading is not limited to respiratory diseases. It can be other kinds of diseases that affect the whole body. We doing okay here? All right, great, thanks. So let's go on to arthropods. There are two ways that insects spread diseases between people. One is what's called mechanical, and this is flies. They land on food or surfaces. They can carry diseases on their feet. So maybe a fly landed on a dead squirrel in your yard and then comes into your kitchen and lands on your dinner. They can also, there are insects that will land at your tear ducts to get salt water from your eyes. And that can cause, yeah, I know, it's weird. And that can transmit diseases. But there is also bite associated. So that's mosquitoes. Mosquitoes doesn't mean ticks, and a few other things that aren't that common in the US, like kissing bugs. And those diseases are fascinating from a biological perspective, because a mosquito and a person are very different, but the disease has to be able to survive in both organisms. So there's a lot of complexity with these diseases as a general rule. And we think of malaria, Lyme disease, plague, Lyme, not limb. These diseases tend to be very nasty. And it's often said that mosquitoes are the deadliest animal on Earth after humans, because they spread these diseases. It's estimated that in the history of humanity, malaria has probably killed more humans than any other single disease. Nate.
This is a two-pronged question. One, is malaria a parasitic infection or is it a virus? And two, how is it that these diseases don't affect the carriers, being the mosquitoes, but they affect humans?
Those are two excellent questions. Yes, malaria is a parasite. We are going to talk in a good bit of detail about that later on in the semester. These diseases do affect the insect. So mosquitoes with malaria do have symptoms of the disease. They're not the same as in humans, obviously, but it does affect them. A lot of times these diseases will cause the insect to bite people more often. When we talk about plague is transmitted by the bite of fleas, and the plague bacteria causes problems in the digestive tract of fleas so that they can't get as much nourishment every time they feed, so they have to feed more often.
That's very good. I never knew that. One last question about mosquitoes. I'm sorry. I'm pretty sure it's impossible, but why is it that mosquitoes can't like transmit HIV/AIDS between different people if they're constantly like biting blood?
Yeah, so with HIV, it's because HIV can't infect the mosquito. So the mosquito takes a blood meal, she digests the blood, and once she's digested those blood cells, that's it. The HIV virus is dead. It simply cannot survive in the mosquito. And they don't take blood meals multiple times from multiple people at a time. They take a blood meal and then they go digest.
I have a question. So do they typically come from the animals that the mosquitoes are eating, these types of diseases?
Could you repeat that? I've got to turn my volume up.
Do these diseases typically come from the animals that the mosquitoes are eating and then they're given to humans, or do they kind of just come from insect life?
They come from whatever the insect is feeding on, and it can be animals or it can be other people. Malaria can survive in the mosquito, so it's usually transmitted from person to person because it's infecting the mosquito. Lyme disease, that reservoir is, I can't remember now. I think it's mice. It's either mice or deer. There's this whole complex life history there between mice and deer and humans. I do know that there are, getting kind of off the track here, there are plants, garden plants, that are considered invasive species in New England. And if they get out of control, either in a wild space near the house or in your backyard, they attract more mice. And if there are more mice around, you are more likely to get Lyme disease. So there's a direct link between certain invasive plant species and your risk of Lyme disease in any given area. Juliana, go ahead.
Yeah, I just have a quick comment or question. So the plant species that you're talking about, I believe it was around my house. It was something called the Japanese root plant. I don't know if you've heard of that.
I'm not familiar with that one. I know English ivy is a problem. Porcelain berry is a problem. Burning bush is a problem.
Okay.
I don't know about that one specifically, but if it has a lot of fruit and it covers a dense area of ground, then it probably is.
Yeah.
Any other questions on arthropods, flies, and other biting insects?
I did a paper on yellow fever for my history class, and like when it's really humid, if there's like a really humid summer or something, like there can be a larger outbreak of it.
Yeah, that's true. Bite associated diseases do go up when there's a lot of moisture, because the population of insects go up when there's a lot of moisture. Yep. All right. So for fecal or oral, I'm going to start by talking about contaminated food. Most of the time when food is contaminated, it is because of feces. And food can be contaminated at any stage of production. So it can be contaminated when it's growing in the field. Microorganisms in the soil, these are usually bacteria, can be taken up by the crop. This is especially true, of leafy greens. And when it's taken up from the soil by a crop, it gets inside the plant tissues. So the bacteria, like I said, it's usually bacteria, gets inside the leaves of lettuce. So washing does nothing for this. How do the feces get in the crops? Well, having live cows too close to a crop, that's one way. Deer coming into the fields is one way. Sadly, so is inadequate facilities for farm workers. Nate.
I thought that cow manure was like an effective fertilizer, or is it have to undergo like treatment and stuff? Yeah.
Yeah, it has to be composted before it's safe. Composting raises the heat of the manure to a point that it kills off most bacteria. Yep. And then it makes excellent fertilizer. We can also have contamination during processing. So a lot of times this is going to be from sick workers. And it's particularly true of things like bagged lettuce and pre-cut fruits, because those get handled more and they're more likely to, there's more surface area to get exposed to bacteria and to hold on to that bacteria. And of course, preparation. Sick food workers can definitely spread their disease into the food. And they may or may not know they're sick, but this is the primary way that hepatitis A is spread. Whoever is making the food is sick. The virus gets in the food, and then people eat it and take it in. This is not going to be a way something like, say, COVID would be spread. COVID's not going to be spread through your digestive tract. You have to inhale that virus. We can also talk, I want to talk specifically about shellfish. When I'm talking about shellfish, we can also talk about crustaceans and fish. So shellfish in particular are pretty dangerous. They can take up toxins, oops, microorganisms from red tide. So if you hear about red tide and they say you can't harvest clams from this area because of red tide, it's because they take up the toxins, they take up the microorganisms, and those toxins and microorganisms get concentrated in their tissues. That's one of the big reasons governments limit where and when you can harvest things like clams and mussels. They can also take up toxins from the water. So lead, plastic, chemicals associated with plastic manufacturing, DDT, and because of the way these things get taken up, they can concentrate in lobsters and crabs and shellfish and fish. And then we eat those and we have a concentrated amount of those toxins or bacteria. Or are there any viruses? I don't know that there are any viruses you get from shellfish, but definitely bacteria and toxins. Juliana, go ahead.
Now, this just a quick question. Is this like cooked, uncooked, all across the board? Because I love like lobster and like these things. So
yeah. So that is an excellent question. Certainly raw is worse. But if we're talking about toxins from red tide, or we're talking about toxins that are in the water that get concentrated in the tissues, cooking doesn't necessarily work with those. So you want to, in an ideal world, you know where your food comes from. It's hard to find that out. New England, the water's pretty good. So the local lobster's probably good. You want to watch the shellfish, make sure that it was harvested safely from a place that doesn't have a lot of chemical pollutants, but you're pretty good with lobsters. I don't know if I've mentioned it, but I live in California, and the water out here is near where I live is very, very contaminated with, of all things, DDT, which has been banned for decades. Because it turned out that some corporation decided, instead of properly disposing of the DDT when it was banned, they would just put it in barrels and dump it in the ocean. And now those barrels are leaking. I am not eating locally caught fish. It's not safe here. We have it, if it's imported, that's okay. If it's fresh water, that's okay. But locally caught, no. New England, much cleaner water. While we're talking about food, mammals in the food chain can also transmit diseases. So poultry is probably the safest animal product you can eat. But cows, pigs, goats, and wild game meat, so venison or rabbit, those can all transmit diseases. What I've got here This is a trichinosis parasite. It's a microscopic, whoops, I spelled it wrong. It's a microscopic parasite that can be found in pork. This is why you need to cook pork thoroughly. If you cook it, great. But if you like your food rare, not pork. For most diseases, cooking destroys infectious organisms. Not toxins, so red tide is still an issue, but most things. The big exception was mad cow disease, which was spread through beef. As of now, it's, as far as we know, completely eliminated from the US. So, Nate, go ahead.
Just while we're on the topic of pigs and bovine and other livestock, what was I going to say? I forget. I'll think of it again. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Nope, lost. Swine flu. What was the origin of that? I mean, I'm assuming pigs, but was it a mutated version of some other virus or?
Swine flu was a form of flu. Flu is a very interesting virus because the flu that infects pigs can also infect humans and birds. The bird flu, the flu that infects birds, can infect pigs and humans. Human flu can infect pigs. Not sure if human flu can go into birds, but when a pig gets infected with human flu and a bird flu or a pig flu, those flu viruses can kind of hybridize and create a new strain of flu. And so the swine flu is an example of that. It's a cross between a human specific flu and a pig specific flu that then spread into people, but it's not through food. So it gets into the farm worker, and then the farm worker who interacts with the pigs, and then the farm worker spreads it.
So it's an airborne transmission?
It is airborne transmission, yes. And we'll talk a little bit more about that cycle. We have a lecture on the 1918 flu. Okay, oh, I was talking about mad cow. So mad cow disease is not caused by a traditional infectious organism. It's caused by a prion. I'm going to talk about those at the end of this lecture. It's not contagious from person to person. There is an exception there, but I'm not going to go into that till we talk about prions. Cooking does not kill it. There's no treatment, and it is lethal. So you may or may not know this, but in the US, all of our dairy products are pasteurized, which is a heating process that's designed to kill microorganisms. Other countries do not require this. We do. So we are not allowed what's called raw milk. Other countries drink it. We are not allowed legally to sell or purchase it. And of course, while we're talking about food, raw cookie dough. We talk about how you can get food poisoning from raw cookie dough.
It's so delicious though.
Oh, it is. It is. And I am willing to take the risk of getting food poisoning.
Is it from the egg? Is it
It's
the raw egg?
not. It's
I think
not
it's
the
just raw
egg.
cookie dough.
The yeast?
No. You put yeast
Milk?
in your cookie dough?
I don't know. I'm just saying things. Milk?
It's the flour.
Flour? What?
Yes, raw flour can be contaminated with bacteria that cause food poisoning. So don't eat raw flour. Nate, your hand is up again.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry about that. E. coli, is that a virus or is that a bacteria?
It's a virus.
Oh, okay.
Yep. And it is one of the ones that can cause food poisoning. It's not the only one.
Yeah, I had norovirus like 3 weeks ago.
Oof, I'm
so-
sorry.
Yeah, I think it was from Chipotle. So just a heads up. I actually had that, and then right after I had the COVID.
Oh, man.
And yeah, I actually think the stomach flu was like way worse. That's just me.
Yeah, well, you must have had
They
mild
teamed
COVID.
up together. It wasn't a good time.
No, definitely not a good time. Norovirus is a real problem on cruise ships. A lot of people get food poisoning on cruise ships that's actually a norovirus. And not all strains of E. coli cause disease. Contaminated water. This is a huge problem worldwide. 1 in 3 people around the world do not have access to clean drinking water. 1 in 3. And even people who have access in some of these impoverished countries, they have to walk miles to get water. I left a pair of my favorite shoes in Africa one year for a woman who had to walk miles every day to get water for her family to drink. She didn't have a pair of shoes. I couldn't handle that. So I left her my shoes.
My dad went to Ghana and left everything. He came home in like a sheet.
Yes.
But he loved it. It made him, they were so appreciative. So for him, he felt like he was rewarded from giving away all of his stuff. But he was really this big guy on the plane in like a damn sheet. It was hilarious.
Yeah. I always leave things when I go to Africa. Shoes, clothes, water bottles. Yeah, I think when I went to Malawi, which is one of the most impoverished countries in the world, I basically needed one less suitcase coming home. One suitcase was empty, and the other one was packed with things that I had bought from the locals. So yeah, it does make you feel good. You feel like you're helping. Nate.
For like waterborne illnesses, is that like cholera, dysentery? Are those a couple of I know in America there was like in the 1800s cholera outbreaks were huge.
Yeah. So yeah, we are definitely talking about cholera. Dysentery. Norovirus can be spread this way. And these contaminants get into the water because of poor sanitation and poor infrastructure, or complete lack thereof. In the US, most places our tap water is safe to drink. It's very highly regulated. But our sewage infrastructure is failing in a lot of places. So carrying sewage weight to the sewage treatment plant, a lot of those pipes are leaking. And after major storms, you'll often see beach closures. That's because the sewage system fails and bacteria get into the ocean. And it's concentrated at the beach right after a major storm. And of course, major storms are increasing due to climate change. So we can expect to see more and more of this as a problem. You cannot tell by looking, smelling, or tasting water if it's contaminated. As I mentioned, in the US, tap water is usually safe. It is more regulated than bottled water. So if you think bottled water is a safer alternative, it's not. And in fact, most bottled water is straight out of the tap. It's just they bottle the tap water and they sell you their product. So what you're really buying is plastic bottles. Now, this is a fun story. Shellfish are highly sensitive to certain common pollutants in the water. Water quality is really important to them. I mean, some things they don't care about, which is why we have to worry about consuming shellfish. You know, red tide doesn't bother them. But things like gasoline, if there's gasoline in the water, they hate this. So we can use these as sentinel animals. If local shellfish decline, that's a sign to check the water. And some places have captive populations. So these mussels, these are mussels, freshwater mussels, are in Minneapolis. And they live in a container where water from the Mississippi constantly flows through. And these wires are set up to detect if the mussels, if their shells are open or closed. If they're open, that means the water is probably really nice and clean. If they close, that is often a warning sign that there's some sort of pollution in the water, especially things like gasoline, factory waste products, you know, the common sorts of things you see in freshwater. It is a cheap and effective way to monitor the water quality. And mussels can live for up to 50 years. So these guys can work for Minneapolis for decades. I love that story. Oh. Okay, I thought I had put a different slide in. I didn't. We mentioned cholera a few minutes ago. cholera is actually, there is a pandemic of cholera right now in impoverished countries. The whole cholera story is very interesting. If you want to do your project on that, let me know and I will send you some information about the whole cholera story. It's a relatively new disease. It has only been reported since the 1800s. And it has multiple pandemics. And like I said, there is one right now. Water can also be contaminated by non-infectious stuff. I'm pretty sure I've said this. Lead from pipes, but also things like pesticides and herbicides. So stuff that people put on their lawns to have that perfect monoculture manicured lawn can end up in the water supply and can cause lots of problems. The next mode of transmission I want to talk about are contact transmission, which also includes sexual transmission. So when we talk about sexually transmitted infections, or STIs, 1 in 5 Americans has at least one STI. They're very, very common. The best thing you can do to prevent infection with one of these, condoms, people. Use them reliably, no exceptions. They prevent the spread of most STIs, including the really dangerous ones. They don't prevent the spread of HPV, or human papillomavirus. But we have a vaccine for HPV. Yay! HPV, most people who get HPV will either clear the virus, not have any symptoms, maybe genital warts. Usually it's safe, but it can cause cancer. And we think about cervical cancer. This is why women get pap smears, because it's trying to detect HPV infections that can cause cervical cancer. But it can also cause cancer of the penis, the testes, the vagina, the anus, the mouth, and the throat. So it can cause cancer in all of those places. The vaccine is very, very, very effective at preventing cancer caused by HPV. Nate.
How does the virus cause cancer?
So
Because I know cancer is like a it's your cells become genetic mutated and they just start multiplying out of control.
yes, you're exactly right. HPV can, when it gets into your cells, it can insert some of its DNA into your chromosomes, into your DNA.
Which is in the video.
Which is in the video? Awesome. There's a certain group of viruses that can insert their genetic material into your DNA. HPV preferentially inserts in locations where if the gene is mutated, they're more likely to cause cancer. Does that answer that for you, Nate?
Yeah, so it modifies like genetic information that has more of a variability of becoming mutated, therefore leading to like those genes are more susceptible to viral caused mutations. Is that
Not quite. The virus chooses where where its genes go, and the virus prefers for their genes to go in locations where, if there are mutations, it's more likely to lead to cancer. Okay, let me whiteboard this because I can see a lot of thinking and confusion.
I wonder, could we reverse engineer it to find cells that are, since it can find cells that are susceptible to cancer, I wonder, could we use it as markers for cells that could turn into cancer also?
Not quite.
Okay, cheers.
Okay, so here is some DNA. This is your DNA. And right here is the location for a gene. I'm going to say P53. P53 is a gene that normally blocks cell division in cells where the DNA is damaged. So if your DNA is damaged, this gene says we are not going to divide. Now here's a gene from HPV, and it wants to insert in your DNA. And when it decides to insert in your DNA, it says, I want to be here. This is where I want to be. So if the virus, see if I can, oh, didn't mean to do an arrow. Hang on. If the virus gene inserts into the location where P53 is, then P53 cannot function anymore, and it cannot stop cell division. So it takes multiple mutations for a cell to become cancerous. This makes the cell more likely to become cancerous if there are other mutations. Is that a little clearer?
Yes. So basically the virus is attacking the gene or genome that prevents your cells from multiplying where there's DNA damage.
Yes.
Do you think there'll ever be a way that people can enhance things like the P53 gene or enhance genetic? I know it's like murky territory, but
it's very murky territory. There are people investigating repairing genes like P53 if they're mutated. So P53, if it's mutated, it increases your risk for cancer. It does not guarantee that you are getting cancer. So people are looking to find ways to repair P53 if it's been damaged, such as through HPV infection. We probably don't want to enhance it. Enhancing it could potentially cause problems with normal cell division, which is needed for repair of damaged tissues and for growth. So most things in the body, there's an ideal range And if you get too far out of that range, there's problems. That is getting a good bit away from epidemics there. So let's go back. Back to here. Okay. If you think you have a sexually transmitted infection, see your doctor. So STIs range from, mild conditions or asymptomatic conditions to infertility, which is mostly associated with gonorrhea, and syphilis, if untreated, can cause brain damage and death. And it can cause those years after the initial infection. So it's very important to be treated if you have an STI.
Just in terms of syphilis, are we going to be talking about like the Tuskegee experiments at all in this class?
We are not, because of time issues, and because, frankly, I'm not sure that I could do a lecture on the Tuskegee incidents without getting so angry that I start crying.
Yeah, that's fair.
It's horrible, and it's very upsetting to me. Okay. Contact transmission includes sexual transmission, but it also includes hands and surfaces. So your hands can touch a contaminated surface. You can shake hands with somebody, and you can spread diseases from yourself to them or from them to you. This can cause the spread of the common cold, which can also be airborne, chickenpox, and pink eye or conjunctivitis. And a lot of fecal oral transmission and airborne transmission. A lot of diseases that spread that way can also be spread by contact. So diseases aren't limited to one way of transmission, usually. HIV is a big exception. So doorknobs are often problematic. Toys at daycare, very problematic. And generally speaking, most of these, you have to contact your mucous membranes. So that's touching your lips, your nose, your eyes, your genitals when you go to the bathroom, that sort of thing. When I was working as a virologist, I was working on HIV, and you could tell the virologists in the company bathroom because we were the ones who came into the bathroom, washed our hands, and then used the bathroom. Okay. All right, so those are the major modes of transmission. The next thing I want to talk about is where do diseases come from? This image is what's called the emerging infectious disease daisy. So diseases can start from wildlife, from domestic animal, from humans. And so wildlife diseases can spread from one place to another within wildlife by moving animals. You may have heard of chronic wasting disease in deer. There's a lot of concern about this, and it is spread by people moving deer from one location to another. These can be deer that are zoo animals, they can be pets, or they can be moved for hunting purposes. Humans can get diseases from wildlife by moving into the wildlife habitat, disturbing the ecosystem, or contacting physical contact with wild animals. Don't pet wild animals, guys. Don't, please. That is a major way that a disease can get into humans. Diseases that circulate in humans can spread to other humans. Global travel is an issue. Urbanization, living in dense conditions. Biomedical manipulation sounds worse than it is, but that's really medical treatments that like blood transfusions or tissue transplants that can transmit from one person to another. Domestic animals, agriculture intensifies diseases within domestic animals. And of course, domestic animals and wildlife often interact, again, encroaching on the wildlife habitat and, just interacting with the wildlife. So I'm going to go to the whiteboard here so I can write a whole bunch of stuff. So when we're talking about origin of a pandemic, an existing disease can evolve. It can evolve to spread faster or be deadlier. We see this a lot with flu. We get a new strains of flu every year. It evolves very, very quickly and can cause new outbreaks in people who maybe were exposed last year and are immune to last year's flu, but not this year's. New people who are vulnerable increase in a population. New people can be births or immigrants. So people may come into a population where disease circulates and everybody's kind of immune, but once you get enough vulnerable people, then you can have another major outbreak. Or immunity can wane. Getting a disease does not make you immune to it forever for a lot of diseases. Your immune system can remember diseases for a certain amount of time, but for some diseases, your immune system doesn't remember for very long at all. Nate.
Is chicken pox one of those where like you get it once and you can't get it again? Or is that shingles or something? I'm getting them mixed up.
Chicken pox is interesting. Chicken pox and herpes are diseases that once you get them, you have them forever. They can get into your central nervous system. And if they get into cells in your central nervous system, the immune system cannot get them out. And so those viruses sit in the central nervous system, and occasionally they will try and spread out into the rest of the body, and you can have an outbreak of herpes, for example, but your immune system then shuts them down. So shingles is when chickenpox tries to come out of the immune system, but the person's immune system has forgotten chickenpox, and you get that nasty rash. So it's not that, I mean, your immunity is waning in that case, but you're not getting the virus again. We are seeing people who had COVID getting COVID a second time. So the immunity for COVID does not seem to, or naturally, the natural immunity for COVID does not seem to last very long. Alexis, go ahead.
I just have a question about like shingles. So I know there's like a shingles vaccine now. So if you were to get the vaccine before you had a shingles outbreak, would that like prevent you from ever having one?
It's not 100%, but the newer shingles vaccine does significantly reduce your risk of having a shingles outbreak. It reminds your immune system of what chickenpox looks like, so your immune system can stop that virus before it starts causing problems. If you got the chickenpox vaccine as a child, you never got chickenpox in the first place, you're not going to get shingles, period.
And then I just have another question like on top of that.
Yep.
So like if you have a weakened immune system, will you have like your outbreak longer, or like will it be stronger than it would if you had like a healthy immune system?
Yeah, so shingles is the disease of older people because after 50, your immune system does weaken. If you are immunocompromised for another reason, you are at increased risk for shingles outbreaks, no matter what your age is. Will it be stronger? Will it last longer? Maybe, but it's going to be highly variable depending on the specifics of the immune system problems, or the exactly why the immune system is weaker, which is a broad way of saying I don't think we know for sure, but it does definitely increase your risk of getting shingles. All right, we are out of time. Any last questions?
Are you gonna grade journal 1? Because I don't want to start part 2 just to make sure I'm doing it right. So will you grade it before Sunday, possibly?
Possibly.
Okay, all right, that's fine. Thank you, Professor.
Here's the thing with the journals.
Oh, you did say that. We could just say blah, 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 and then say, hey, no, I'm joking.
Yeah, you can say a lot of stuff in the journals, and as long as I feel like you thought about it, you're good to go.
Okay, cheers. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Okay, so next week we're going to talk about talk in more detail about the origins of epidemics. We're going to talk about the types of things that cause contagious diseases or epidemics. So we're going to talk about what is a virus, what is a bacteria, what is a parasite, and then we're going to start on HIV. So Lots of talk about sex next week. Nate.
I was thinking about like viruses, diseases. Was typhoid fever, was that a waterborne illness as well?
I don't think typhoid. I think typhoid was fecal oral.
I just Googled it. Contaminated food, rarely contaminated water.
There you go.
So it wasn't like a primary method.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Typhoid Mary was a cook. That's how you remember that one.
What was it? She somehow had like natural immunity, infected like a ton of people, never knew it.
Yeah, that's a long story. Something else that you could do a project on.
It's a good idea. I might do it actually. Thank you.
All right, if that's it, gonna call it a day. And I'll see everybody next week.